This episode of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast is brought to you by Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company in Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use the name Mac Payne, one word, at the checkout and get 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1822 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the unsung heroes of the Vietnam War. A group of people who served over there who do not get the recognition and gratitude they deserve. That's all going to change on this podcast. I'm going to talk to you about the Army Nurse Corps and specifically about Phyllis Cogan, who served as a member of the Army Nurse Corps in Vietnam. The purpose of this podcast is to let you know more about the Army Nurse Corps and the experiences of one particular Army nurse, Phyllis Cogan, then Lieutenant Cogan. It's an interesting story that needs to be told. Anybody in Vietnam who were injured or wounded and had to have assistance from Army nurses know exactly what I'm talking about when I call them the wonderful, unsung heroes of that war. There's something about it. When you're hurt and you need help and someone provides you with assistance, you don't care who they are, what they are, where they came from. You are just so thankful they're helping you. And that's how most everybody in Vietnam who were wounded or needed help felt about the nurses. That's why I'm sharing with you the story of Phyllis Cogan. Her maiden name was Breen. She was probably from Indiana since she attended Indiana University. There was a story about her at the Army Heritage Center Foundation, right there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm going to share a portion of her story with you so that you can gain a greater appreciation for the job the Army nurses did in Vietnam. Most of the Army nurses over there were female, but I did run into a few male nurses. I remember chatting with one of them and I said, "Does anybody ever give you a hard time for being in the Nurse Corps?" He said, "Oh yes, every once in a while someone will do something stupid like that, but they generally wake up in a few minutes after I punch their lights out." That means nurses were no patsies, male or female. They had to do some heavy and gruesome work over there. Without any further ado, let's take a look at Phyllis Cogan's story. Dateline, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. In 1967, Phyllis Cogan was a student at Indiana University, Indiana, when she decided to join the Army Nurse Corps to help pay for college. They had something called the Army Student Nurse Program, through which you could have your last year or two paid for. You would enlist in the Women's Army Corps at the time. You enlisted as a private first class. You got an ID card and you could use the PX, and it sounded like a great deal. I think I went to that PX twice the whole time because it wasn't really convenient, but it was nice to have. But what was really important was that you got a stipend. It was under $100, but it seemed like a fortune. 6 months before I graduated, I was honorably discharged from the Women's Army Corps, and the next day, I was assigned as a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, and they paid for my last year of school. It was wonderful. I'd say the Army got their money's worth on that deal. Though her primary motivation was financial, she says there were other reasons for joining the Army. My father had been a Marine in World War II. This was a man who could not see the American flag without breaking into tears. He did think America could do no wrong, but he had great pride in what he had done. My mother was a little concerned that military nurses could get the wrong kind of reputation. My father replied, "Well, if they know her, they'll know better. And if they don't know her, what do you care?" I always knew that my father was proud of my service. After graduation, she went through basic training, took a little leave to visit her family, and spent about 6 months at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, before heading off to Vietnam. I bet she spent a lot of time in the Womack Army Hospital there. Continuing. She arrived in Vietnam on April the 19th, 1969, her brother's birthday, and departed 1 year later on April the 19th. Speaking about her arrival in Vietnam, she said, "I thought it was kind of exciting, actually. We flew in the middle of the night, slept briefly on cots, and were sent out the next night. I was sent to Chulai and was assigned to the 27th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. I was 22 years old and could call myself fairly naive. I hadn't seen anything horrible happen yet, but I knew bad things did happen. At that point, it was an adventure, but I had no idea what to expect." Speaking of the 27th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, I would not be surprised at all if some of John Shoemaker's men were sent to that hospital, because he served in the Americal Division that was headquartered right there in Chulai. A very interesting place. Continuing. When I got to the hospital, that was an adjustment. They showed us our hooches. They were semi-permanent wooden buildings. Of course, it was hot, but they had a separate room for the nurses and doctors who worked the night shift that had air conditioning, because you could not have it in each room. And it was so hot you couldn't sleep. But that broke down halfway through and never got replaced. But we all survived it. The joke was that the pilots had air conditioning, but they said, "Well, you don't want a sleepy pilot." I thought, you might not want a sleepy nurse either. The hooches weren't bad. They were small, and you had a few shelves, your footlocker, a small cabinet, and a little closet for hanging clothes. The Mama-Sans did our laundry. We ate in the mess hall. The food was for young men, so it wasn't dietary heaven for a young woman who wanted to watch her weight. But the food was solid. I don't remember disliking it. Phyllis and the other nurses enjoyed a few perks of being the only American women around. There was a civilian engineering outfit nearby, and they would invite the American nurses over to their compound fairly often. And they had steaks and shrimp and all the good stuff. And the wine, so it was nice. I didn't think the male nurses got invited very often. No kidding, Phyllis. Continuing. Phyllis soon discovered the old Army tradition of learning by doing. When I got there, they said, "Have you ever started an IV?" And I said, "Yeah." I'd been on a ward at Fort Bragg and learned how to do IVs with an 18-gauge needle. That just sounds big. 18-gauge needle? Don't know how big they are, but they just sound big. I always remember when I was in the Army, anytime they wanted to take your blood with one of those big needles, and two people would come in, and one of them would be OJT, and the one who knew how to do it was telling the OJT how to do it, and it would always make you nervous. Seemed like those were the times I would always get a big bruise after they took the blood. It was probably an 18-gauge needle they used. Enough of that. Back to the story. So they said, "Oh, good, we'll put you in the ER." I said, "I don't have any ER experience. I just got out of school, and my school didn't have an ER." I got down there and discovered that the IV they wanted me to use was even bigger. I said I couldn't get that in a calf, and they said, "Before long, you'll be getting it in children," which turned out to be true. Her patients in the ER were mostly injured. She saw a lot of injured limbs, shrapnel wounds that were not too deep, and some head wounds. We did lose some patients. They came in with severe injuries that we could not treat. One of the memories I would almost like to forget and can't was a young man still alert saying, "Please, please don't let me die." He was bleeding out right in front of us and we could not stop it. That was one of those memories that stick out and doesn't want to go away. One day they brought some body bags in and the sergeants would not let me go back to deal with them. An officer had to go back there and they would not let us go back. They said, "These bodies have been in the water for several days and you don't want to see this." I don't think it was a lack of respect for our abilities, but a desire to protect us. From the ER, Phyllis transferred to the surgical unit, then to the medical unit, and finally to the Vietnamese ward. She especially liked that ward where she worked with a lot of children and local women. Many of them were injured in the war, some from what we refer to today as collateral damage, but she didn't dwell on that. I did not even at that point ask how they got those injuries. They just came to us for help and we helped them. Phyllis stayed in the Army and served until retiring as a lieutenant colonel in the late 1980s. Reflecting on her time in Vietnam, she said simply, "I don't regret going, and I would have gone again if we had been there long enough." That's what I was. I was an Army nurse. Hear, hear, Phyllis Cogan. We thank you so much for your service in the Army Nurse Corps, especially the services you rendered in Vietnam. This is one Vietnam veteran who had the highest regard for all the people in the medical fields over there, all the way from the medics that would walk around in the woods with the infantry units to the medevac crews who flew the wounded back to the hospitals and the doctors and nurses who did their best to heal the wounded soldiers back at the hospitals. Phyllis Cogan, I appreciate your service to your country so much. I am hereby issuing you unofficial Vietnam Veteran News podcast salute. Thank you very much. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1822 of the Vietnam Veteran News podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.